Welcome back. This is lecture 3. We are in module 5 now, and this is lecture 3 of module 5. So, this module we are talking about the various types of language contact and the resultant changes in the language that happens. So, contact induced language change. In the last 2 lectures we have looked at different types of language change that takes place. Today we will talk about a new variety. The new variety that we will discuss today is called mixed language. So, this is roughly the road map. What are mixed languages, the grammar and the cultural significance of those, and then we will also discuss some of the mixed languages in India. And then we will discuss another type of language which is called language isolate with some examples from India as well as other parts of the world. So, we start with mixed language. What is mixed language? Now, this is yet another kind of result of contact induced languages or contact languages you can call them. Now, this is a unique type. Before we have seen that there is something called pidgin, and then pidgin goes on to become a creole, and the creole also has a life of its own. There will be decreolization processes and so on and so forth. Now, mixed languages are neither pidgins nor creoles, they are a third type. They have been defined in multiple ways in the last few decades. There are different scholars have defined it differently, but largely there is some amount of convergence as well. So, for example, Thomasson calls it these non-pidgin, non-creole varieties are a third type of contact language, which is a bilingual mixture that must have been created by bilinguals. So, as far as Thomasson's definition goes, this is a scenario which typically needs bilingualism as a precursor. When languages come into contact and the people are bilingual, there is a certain amount of mixture that happens, and as a result we have what we call mixed language. On the other hand, Becker proposed the term mixed or intertwined languages. He gave different name. So, this is a language, a particular type of contact language in which the inflectional morphology and grammar of one language combines with the lexicon of a second. So, the two languages do not contribute exactly in the same way. One language contributes the morphology and the grammar, another language contributes the lexicon. That is how Becker put it. Similarly, Seibauer defines language mixing or intertwining as two languages combining in such a way that usually the grammar of one language is grafted on to the vocabulary of another. So, there is a lot of agreement between Becker and Seibauer that one language supplies the grammatical component, the other language supplies the vocabulary, the lexicon. So, this is how languages, mixed languages come into being. Now, the reason why we call them very interesting or different from any other kinds of contact induced changes is because of certain features which are typical to mixed languages. One is that they are new languages, they are not continuation of one of the ancestral languages with some admixture. It is not like that. So, it is not language A and language B coming together to create language AB, that is a new language. It is not the continuation of A with some mixture from B or the continuation of B with some mixture of A. That is not how mixed languages are. They are a completely separate language on their own. So, this is not what one of the ancestor languages could have become through diachronic changes, or diachronic as in changes through time, over a period of time. Languages change all the time. One language might go through so many changes that after few centuries it might look completely different. That is a possibility that happens, but this is not the case with mixed languages as either. This is a mixture of elements of two languages, most importantly almost in equal degree. So, if the entire vocabulary is from language 1, the entire grammar will be from language 2. That is another interesting factor, and because of all of these, this cannot be clearly put under any of the genetic families that the ancestral languages belonged. Languages belong to language families that we already know. Now, mixed languages cannot be put under the language family of either language 1 or language 2, because they are not those languages anymore, they are completely different languages. And very often they are also intrinsically connected to the formation of a new ethnic identity. When different kinds of people come together, create a different mixed race, so that is also a possibility. Very often mixed languages are also spoken by a new ethnic community. coming together up to different communities, thereby creating a mixed race, and so ethnic identity also changes alongside the languages that change. Now, this is a very short overview of how the idea of mixed language developed over period of time. So, the early reference of such languages goes back to Goodman's work in 71, where he described a particular Bantu particular language which has Bantu grammar and Cushitic vocabulary, Cushitic or so vocabulary. So, this is how the language was created, grammar from Bantu and Cushitic provided the vocabulary, and this is how it was studied, and this goes back to all the way to 1971. This language was studied later also by many other scholars. Till the 1990s, these were not considered a variation caused due to language contact, rather they were labeled as a case of code switching. Code switching is something that happens in a bilingual society. Code switching as in when you switch between two languages. So, a society that is bilingual automatically will show the code switching and code mixing behavior. So, they will mix one language with another, that is very common in Indian scenario as well. Even when we are speaking in one language, say Hindi, there will be a lot of mixture of words from English language, or even in English we mix Hindi. So, it can be at the grammatical level, it can be at the lexical level and so on. So, that is called code mixing. So, initially this kind of languages were treated as a serious case of code mixing, because there is a lot of mixture. So, they were not considered to be a separate one. So, either code mixing or abstract influence or borrowing. So, when you borrow too much of words from one language into another, that is also another scenario. So, this is how they scholars initially labeled this kind of languages. However, later on this credit goes to Thomason and Kaufman, who established it as a separate variation. It is not, it cannot be clubbed with either code switching or with borrowing or with abstract influence or whatever. This is a separate kind of a variation that results out of a separate kind of language mixing or language contact. And then Becker and Mao further developed the concept and analyzed a few of the mixed languages, with one of the most well known is that of Michev being the first mixed language whose structures and properties were analyzed. We will discuss a number of mixed languages towards the end of the lecture. So, we will not discuss it now. Now, when all of these studies were going on, different theories were being proposed. So, that this as a result there was a necessity for a workshop. So, there was the first workshop on mixed languages was held in 1993 in Leiden University, and that brought together a lot of scholars who were all of them who were working on mixed languages, different mixed languages. They were working on different parts of the world, focusing on different kinds of contact scenario and different mixed languages. So, they all got together, and this field got a lot of boost based on the studies that were presented there and the problems that were discussed, and the way to an extent the way the field was formalized, or let us say the way the major research questions were put forward. What should be the main questions that the field should ask when we are looking at mixed languages. So, these are the 4 domains that were discussed at length in that workshop, and this is how also the later studies were carried out. So, the first main question was the general structure. So, the very basic understanding of a mixed language, how is it structured, which language contributes to what domain, how much, what is the percentage of contribution of language 1 versus language 2 and so on. Are functional and semantic aspects relevant as the source of lexical or grammatical items? What decides? How is it decided which language will contribute what? These are general structure dependent questions. Then if you go a little deeper, we will look at morphology, phonology and syntax. So, in terms of morphology, is there any difference between prefixes versus suffixes, derivation versus inflection, productive versus half productive, all kinds of morphology. So, at the level of morphology, what are the types of what is the treatment, what is the difference between different kinds of morphology. Phonology also, which language is the source of the phonological system, because we said that one language provides the vocabulary, that does not necessarily mean the phonology will be coming from only one, and if it is one, then which one should it be, what decides those. And then syntax also, that was another domain that was discussed heavily. Which language is the source of the word order rules? Which language is the source of the free grammatical morpheme? So, these were some important questions that were discussed in that particular workshop. Now, let us look at the structural features, structural properties, characteristics of mixed language. We have already said that this is the grammar comes from one language and the lexicon from another. So, when we say grammar, we mean phonology, morphology, syntax, all of these properties they will come from one language and the other language will provide the lexicon. This is typically the most important noticeable feature of any mixed language. They resist genetic classification, as we have seen while discussing the definition. They resist genetic classification because both languages not a continuation of any of the languages, any of the contributing languages, and hence they do not fit, and the resultant language also does not fit into any of the categories. Hence, it is very difficult, almost impossible to classify them as belonging to any of the genetic families. And then the grammar versus lexicon the split. Most mixed languages follow this kind of split. So, this is an example, this is one, this is another. In case of Michif, the French noun phrases and Cree verbs. Cree is an indigenous language. So, the Cree morphology comes from Cree and the noun morphology comes from French in this particular case. In another language, for example, this the Malay grammar and Dutch lexicon. This is another language, Indonesia and around. So, this is where the Dutch language provided the lexicon, but the grammar came from the local Malay language. Then you have Medina Lingua, this is where Quechua grammar, which is the Quechua is the indigenous language, plus 90% Spanish lexicon. So, Spain conquered southern part of America and this is the result of that. So, the Quechua is a local language, the grammar is provided by the local language, but the lexicon comes from Spanish. So, this is how most of the mixed languages can be described. So, grammar from one language and the lexicon from another. Only in case of Michif, this is slightly different because noun morphology entirely from one language, verb morphology entirely from another language. So, the classification challenge that we have just said, because classified both on the basis of the lexicon. When we classify languages, they are classified both on the basis of lexicon, especially the core vocabulary. Some part of the vocabulary is core, the most important basic word list, let us say, and those things that are core vocabulary, and some of them will be peripheral. So, based on core vocabulary and grammatical features, languages are classified as belonging to one or the other family. Now, because when we talk about grammatical features, notably morphological similarity, because that is how structure and the categorization goes. But in case of this mixed language, that is not possible because they have genetic connections with two languages, languages, or sometimes these languages may be, for example, we just saw the Quechua and Spanish, so they belong to two different language families. So, now where will the resultant language belong? They do not belong either here or there. So, that is what we mean by difficulty of classifying them as being part of any specific family. Now, this is the problem. Now, this is the reason some scholars have said that let us consider mixed languages as a case of extreme borrowing, because then it will be probably a way to solve this issue of genetic classification. But then other scholars have proposed that this is not possible because mixed language cannot be considered a case of extreme borrowing. The reason being, and one of the most important scholars in this domain is that of Becker, who said that there are certain differences between mixed language and extreme borrowing. Extreme borrowing, even in the case of a very high amount of borrowing, does not typically cross the threshold of 45% of the lexicon. So, because we are talking about primarily of the core lexicon. So, that is another important point. He says that the extreme borrowing will typically be contained by 45% of the lexicon, and also the proportion of foreign lexical items in case of mixed languages will be close to or more than 90%. So, we just saw that in case of Medina Lingua, the Spanish lexicon is more than 90%. So, there is a clear disparity. In case of extreme borrowing also, even when one language has borrowed from another to a very high degree, it is still the threshold is 45% or around approximately. That is one. And then the second question is whether these borrowed items are in the core vocabulary or are peripheral. If it is core vocabulary, then it is one story, if it is not, then that is another story. So, in the mixed languages, most of the core vocabulary tends to be foreign, whereas in case of extreme borrowing, the foreign elements affect the core vocabulary only to a limited extent. So, even when we have a case of extreme borrowing into one language, the borrowing will not affect the core vocabulary so much. Maybe the peripheral vocabulary will change, but core vocabulary will not change so much. But in case of mixed language, the core vocabulary is also from another language. Hence, these are the two parameters on the basis of which we can say that the mixed languages cannot be considered a case of extreme borrowing following Becker. Now, there are different ways mixed languages have been classified. So, we will call it typologies of mixed language, different ways. So, different grounds, different reasons for development. So, there are three important types of idea that has been provided. One is Becker has provided the social ground, where he talks about two distinct types. Temporal development comes from Thomasson and functional distinction comes from Smith. So, in case of Becker, he says that mixed languages developed out of two possible scenarios. One was mixed marriage, this is what created the Michif language, and then the second possibility is it is the secret language of the nomadic people, people from who move from one place to another, nomads. So, they sometimes create mixed languages as a secret code for within group communication, and of course, the mixed marriages. In Thomasson proposes that he makes a division between mixed languages that have developed gradually as opposed to those that are developed abruptly. That is also possible. He creates this kind of two temporal aspects, something that happens overnight, something that happens over a period of time. The latter ones serving a newly formed social group. When you suddenly have a new social group, they need a new language, because languages often also mark the identity. Sometimes it is because of the work that they do, if it is a secretive kind of a group, many things might be there. So, a generation of a new group often needs a new language. So, that is when it starts. But the cases where it is gradual, that can happen in a society in a normal way, that is the other type. Functional distinction, Smith makes this distinction. He makes the distinction between plain mixed languages and symbiotic mixed languages. The former generally are only language spoken in a community, whereas the latter exist with dominant unmixed languages. So, sometimes there is the only one language that the community speaks, and it is the mixed language. Sometimes they speak it alongside other languages. So, that is also another type, that is he calls it symbiotic mixed language. Now, genetic relationship and typological distance, based on these two parameters, there are two possible scenarios. So, typologically close and typologically distant. So, if two languages are typologically close, like their dialects, grammatical morphemes typically will transfer easily. That is what Becker has proposed. But if the languages are typologically distant, grammar is never shared. Instead, a whole grammar from one and the lexicon from another language exists. Michif example, this preserves the Cree polysynthetic verb intact alongside French nominal structure, showing that typological distance is not smoothed out, but maintained. This is a very interesting language where the entire verb morphology. So, they have maintained the typical property of the Cree verb structure and the property of the French nominal structure, noun phrase structure. This is how the genesis has been proposed. So, language intertwining arises out of language intertwining, where distinct from which is distinct from borrowing, shifting, pigeonization or creolization. Social origin often linked to mixed languages or secret in-group identity, which we just saw, and complex variation. So, some cases show simplification like Copper Island Aleut, while others preserve the full complexity. So, Michif for example, has maintained the full complexity of each of the languages without compromising on the grammatical structure. Sometimes in some cases mixed languages actually simplify the grammatical structure. Code switching versus language mixing, this is the some scholars have said that there are similarities between language code switching and language mixing, which we saw before. Of course, this is not always accepted as across the board, but some scholars do understand it as a continuum. So, for example, Peter Auer charts possible continuum between the two from code switching to mixed language. An extreme and locally meaningful contextual switches to fused lects, he calls them fused lects at the other stabilized grammar like mixed varieties. So, from it starts from code mixing and eventually the mixing gets higher and eventually it becomes a fused lect, that is how he looks at it. This dynamic model highlights how these forms can evolve over time in bilingual communities, or because code switching and code mixing exists only in bilingual societies, bilingual multilingual societies. So, this has to be a bilingual society where code mixing starts simply and over a period of time gets more and more complicated, eventually leading to what we see as mixed language. Now, community context and speaker attitudes are also very interesting in this domain. This is typically an in-group code, only it is used by a small number of people, small group of people only for in-group communication, and they differ from code switching because the system is stable and conventionalized. Intelligibility, in terms of intelligibility, speakers of one source recognize familiar elements. So, if it is for example, Michif, the French speakers might follow some amount of Michif, but not entirely, because it has become a different language. So, you will recognize only those that come from your own language. So, that is what that is the limitation of intelligibility with respect to mixed languages. Attitudes are also interesting. Attitudes range from pride. So, Michif speakers show that, Michif and Medina Lingua for example, to secrecy or stigma, that is there among the Romani speakers, they try to keep it secret, and because probably there is some amount of stigma. So, attitude of the community themselves also varies across groups. These are some examples of mixed languages around the world. North America, Michif, which I have talked about, Cree and French. This language generated out of French traders, fur traders, Canadian French fur traders to be precise, and Cree women. So, as these people are these traders are traveling traders. So, when they go through those areas, they married Cree women and moved farther. Their children typically speak Michif. Caribbean island has island Carib, similarly many other languages. Maltese have also been proposed as a mixed language by some scholars. However, later scholars stick to the that this is an extreme case of borrowing rather than mixed language. So, there is a slight debate there, but the rest of the languages are well known mixed languages. So, these are some examples. Pitcairn's, this is one mixed language that has been studied. There was a historically there was a mutiny on the Bounty, on the ship Bounty. This is during the colonial period. So, result of that mutiny was that British sailors married Tahitian women and they were moved on an island, on a remote island, where they were found many years later, and the descendants of those initial rebels were speaking a new language, which was at that time called Pitcairn's language. So, that is one. Russenorsk is another. This is a language spoken in northern Norway until 1917 Russian Revolution. This considered elements taken from both Norwegian and Russian in equal measures and arose out of the trade between Norway and Russia. Similarly, we have Chindo. This is a kind of Chinese. Chinese are descendants of Chinese traders and Indonesian women, and thereby creating a separate ethnic group. Michif I have already talked about, the French and Cree. This is another Aleut, particular variety of Aleut spoken by a handful of elderly people in the Copper Islands in the North Pacific Ocean east of Russia. This is spoken by the descendants of again Russian fur traders and Aleut women. So, they have created another variety. Unlike however, the Michif speakers, these people were never completely broken off from the source language. Michif speakers were broken off from the source language, both Cree and French. Medina Lingua is another, which is a Quechua derived language. Grammar is supplied by Quechua and the lexicon from Spanish. Many scholars believe that this language emerged during the construction of railroad in the area that saw labor migration and urban expansion of the place. This is mostly derived from Spanish and the adverbs. So, the lexicon is from Spanish and the adverbs, pronouns, numerals, conjunctions, etc., they all are from Quechua language. In India also we have cases of mixed language. One of them is the present Great Andamanese. This is classified as present Great Andamanese because this is not how Great Andamanese language was before. So, this is a mixed language combining words from the extinct northern varieties of Andamanese languages. There were 10 different tribes: Kora, Sari, Bo and Jeru. So, these were the languages. There were actually 10. So, they existed long back, and now the current form of the language has words from all of these languages, but Jeru is the language that has given the grammatical base. So, on that base there are other languages that have provided the lexicon. So, this is a remarkable linguistic development that has this the reason why they are the group is very small in number, and they have been reduced to such an extent because of during the colonial period, as which resulted in their tragic decrease in their number and so on. Grammatically speaking, it follows a Jeru pattern with agglutinative morphology and proclitics. Vocabulary sources are taken from all these languages as we just saw. So, they freely alternate words from these languages within one conversation. This pattern matches lexical mixing, a core trait of mixed languages. So, this is in India, this is how this is one mixed language that has been studied at length. Originally there were a lot of diversity, and then population decreased by the late 20th century. Colonial disease, displacement, population collapse reduced these communities to fewer than 50 people on Strait Island in Port Blair. As of today they are even less than that. And then of course, intermarriages happened between among the groups as well as with the outsiders, and multilingualism was another reason. So, eventually a lot of changes happened. So, emergence of present day Great Andamanese is quite recent in that way. Resulted in the emergence of this, it is a coenized and mixed variety as far as Anvita Abbi's research goes. That is how she has categorize this language. Now, this is the grammatical basis is of course given by Jeru, and the other languages have given the vocabulary. Dakhini is another Indian example. The research on Hindi Urdu mix by Subbarao hints that a language mixing outcome witnessed in the grammar of contemporary Dakhini, which is the result of long term diachronic contact between Hindi, Urdu and Telugu. This is the Hindi spoken in Hyderabad and adjacent areas. So, Dakhini Hindi is a very different kind of Hindi, which has a lot of mixture from Urdu as well as Telugu. So, this is also considered as a mixed language in the Indian context. Now, let us move on to the another construct, which is called language isolates. Language isolates are those languages that have no either very little or no structural or historical relationship with any other language. They are also called isolated language. So, they basically remain as islands surrounded by dominant language families and often display unique structural features. So, these languages are generally they are small groups of people who are surrounded by people who speak different language belonging to different language family, but these languages are typically in terms of structure they cannot be connected to any of the surrounding languages. So, they do not classify them as belonging to the language families that you know. So, that is why they are called isolates, language isolates. So, that is why they are also called islands, because often they are surrounded by other language families and often display unique structural features. So, these are some of the features of isolated languages. They often remain undeciphered, insufficient material available. Because of insufficient material they cannot be deciphered, and sometimes the deciphering can be helped by another parallel language, another language that is similar or at least part of the same family. So, when you have figured that out, it is easy to find out how the grammar of the language works, how the lexicon works, but if there is no similarity with any other known language, then it is very difficult to decipher. That is why many of them are undeciphered, and languages where despite sometimes we have a great deal of data, the relationship remains undetermined. So, sometimes there are small groups, then obviously there is no way, but sometimes there is a lot of data, even then it is difficult because the relationship cannot be established. So, there are some examples that we will discuss, but before that historically isolates often reflect the remains of older population overtaken by larger expanding groups. Sometimes what happens, these languages probably are well left out. during migration in the in the ancient times when they were migrating, people migrated from one place to another, maybe they were left out or they were overshadowed by another bigger group which was expanding faster. Many other things could have happened. So, these are pointers to our historic or even prehistoric times mobility or migration pattern also can be understood. Sometimes they are proposed as a pointer to the migration history. Unique features: these languages typically exhibit unusual typological and phonological features, which is why it is difficult to categorize them as part of any of the other families. So, not seen in the dominant families around them, potentially preserving ancient linguistic structures. This is how it has been proposed. These languages are often considered moribund as they are on the brink of extinction. So, language in terms of language endangerment, there are different levels that have been proposed. So, moribund is the last stage before they go extinct, because these languages are often not passed on to the next generation or they are under threat from the larger language and so on, because often they do not learn it as a first language, they also know that language, the younger generation. These are some examples from various parts of the world. So, Tanzania, and then Basque is Europe's language isolate, and then of course, there are many Mexico, Northern Australia, all of that. Some isolates are already extinct. For example, this was spoken in Chile's state of Tierra del Fuego. With the death of in 2022, the last fluent native speaker died recently. So, this was an isolate, language isolate, and the last speaker is dead. So, this was extinct. Many other languages have also very small number of speakers, and only a few have bigger population size. Mapping South Asian language isolates, also we have some of them in Indian subcontinent as well, South Asia as well. So, language isolates are found in remote, typically you find them in remote mountainous or tribal regions, often in areas that have remained relatively isolated from the main population, major population movements and so on. And they represent ancient linguistic lineage. That is true for all, typically to be true for all the isolated languages. So, in this Indian subcontinent, there are two languages that have been studied, that are well known. One of them is Nihali, also called Nahali. This is found in the border areas of Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh, with roughly 2000 to 5000 speakers, but many are not speaking the language anymore. That is what we mean by language endangered language. The children are not anymore learning, so they are shifting to the more dominant local language, Hindi, Marathi and so on. Linguistically speaking, it shows a high amount of borrowing, especially from the neighboring Indo-Aryan, Dravidian and Munda languages. Some core vocabulary and structures such as basic pronouns do not match any surrounding language. So, the core vocabulary, core structure of the language is separate from all the surrounding languages. That is why it is an isolate in the first place. Grammar is agglutinative. However, some scholars argue that Nihali is so mixed, it may not be actually be a true language isolate, but a heavily restructured language. There are disagreements among scholars about the real status. The structure wise, it does not resemble any of the surrounding languages, and one can trace the certain grammatical features to Indo-Aryan, surrounding Indo-Aryan, Dravidian as well as Munda languages. The other language isolate in the Indian subcontinent is that of Burushaski, which is found in the Hunza Valley isolate, primarily spoken in Hunza, Nagar and Yasin valleys of northern Pakistan, close to Jammu and Kashmir in India. Speaker population is not that bad, 87,000 speakers. Linguistic features, no proven family relationship, that is why it is an isolate. One unique feature of Burushaski is their 4 gender system. This language has 4 gender system, features a unique 4-way distinction between male human, female human, countable objects and abstract things. That is how the gender system in this language works, which is very distinct from all the languages that surround it. So, all the neighboring languages, and the verbal inflection is quite complex. It exhibits highly complex verbal inflection pattern, which is again different from the surrounding language families. So, if you want to put it on a map, this is where it is. So, Burushaski is spoken somewhere here and Nahali is here. So, this is inside India, that is slightly, that is in current day Pakistan, that is closer to Indian Jammu and Kashmir. So, these are the 2 language isolates that you can locate in the Indian subcontinent. So, with these two constructs, so one is of course our language isolate and then the mixed language. These two outcomes of language contact we discussed today. In the next lecture, we will look up some other types of possible outcomes of language contact. Thank you.